have thought, a black man standing on his own porch looks suspicious. Minutes later, he regretted everything.
Crimson and azure beams fragmented the hushed suburban dawn, painting agitated, oscillating silhouettes across the meticulously tended grounds. The novice officer's hand wavered uneasily above his sidearm, but it was the seasoned patrolman, his countenance ruddy with unwarranted self-importance, who bellowed the command, "Descend from the veranda and present your identification with utmost immediacy." The individual positioned against the wooden balustrade remained unperturbed. He savored a measured, unhurried draught of his black coffee, a calculated tranquility descending upon his features. He was fully cognizant of the expected trajectory of this encounter. What the presumptuous, scarlet-faced officer failed to apprehend, however, was that the man he was aggressively intimidating was Special Agent Curtis Vaughn, and the constable had just initiated a confrontation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Oak Ridge Estates represented the sort of locale where the most prominent sound on a Saturday morning was the consistent, lulling purr of a sophisticated irrigation system. Situated within an affluent enclave on the periphery of the metropolis, it was a picturesque panorama of expansive Georgian residences, flawlessly delineated driveways, and vibrantly verdant lawns. For Special Agent Curtis Vaughn, acquiring the four-bedroom dwelling at 440 Maplewood Drive was intended to signify a pivotal achievement. It was the crowning accomplishment of protracted, arduous service within the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force. He had devoted 15 years to breaching entry points in the most perilous sectors of the state, pursuing fugitives and dismantling clandestine criminal enterprises. This residence was his well-earned recompense, a serene, secure haven for himself and his daughter Riley, who was completing her second year at a state university. Curtis was a tall, robustly built African-American man with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and eyes that absorbed every minute detail. His bearing was inherently authoritative, a consequence of years spent in a high-pressure, high-stakes vocation. Yet on this particular Saturday morn, he was not Agent Vaughn. He was merely Curtis. He wore faded gray athletic trousers, a simple, well-worn white t-shirt, and slip-on footwear. The autumnal atmosphere was bracing, carrying the subtle fragrance of fallen foliage and distant conifers. He stepped out onto his expansive, dark wood front porch, a steaming chalice of black coffee in his hand. He had not yet fully unpacked the crates. They had recently established residency, and the interior of the house remained a disarray of cardboard boxes, but the porch was perfect. He leaned against the railing, inhaling deeply the suburban air, allowing the lingering tension from his most recent field assignment to dissipate from his musculature. Directly across the thoroughfare, concealed behind the tightly drawn Venetian blinds of 442 Maplewood Drive, Vivian Hargrove was already awake. Vivian considered herself the self-designated protector of Oak Ridge Estates, a woman who treated the Homeowners Association guidelines with the veneration due a sacred artifact. She had resided in the neighborhood for many years and possessed a notorious propensity for leveraging the local constabulary over trivial transgressions. An unfamiliar vehicle parked slightly over a property boundary, a landscaping crew commencing work prematurely. Vivian stood in her drawing room, her gaze narrowed as she peered through a thin aperture in her blinds. She had observed the moving vans recently, but had not managed to obtain a clear view of the new occupants. Now, observing Curtis standing on the veranda, a surge of prejudiced apprehension coursed through her. To Vivian, Curtis did not conform to the image of an Oak Ridge resident. Within her constricted perspective, a tall, dark-skinned man in casual loungewear pacing about a high-end property did not register as a homeowner. It registered as a threat. She did not approach to introduce herself. She did not offer a greeting. She did not even pause to consider the moving cartons still visible through the expansive front window of Curtis's domicile. Instead, Vivian retrieved her telephone and dialed the local police dispatch. "Yes, dispatch. My designation is Vivian Hargrove, 442 Maplewood Drive," she whispered, her voice quavering with manufactured alarm. "I require an officer to be dispatched immediately. There is a suspicious individual loitering on the porch of the residence across the street. The house has just been sold, and the proprietors are not presently present. I suspect he may be surveilling the property." The dispatcher, a weary woman managing a multitude of morning calls, requested a description. "He is a substantial African-American male attired in unkempt garments," Vivian responded, her tone laced with disdain. "He is merely standing there, surveying his surroundings. He unequivocally does not belong here. Kindly dispatch personnel before he attempts an intrusion." Unaware of the telephone call that had just cast him as an interloper in his own abode, Curtis concluded his coffee. He placed the mug upon a diminutive wicker side table and commenced an examination of the woodwork on the veranda railing, making a mental note that it might benefit from a fresh application of sealant prior to the arrival of the winter snowfall. He was completely at ease. It was a rare, exquisite moment of absolute serenity. It persisted for only a brief duration longer. The distinct sound of heavy tires traversing fallen leaves shattered the quiet. Curtis looked upward, his trained gaze instantly focusing on the black and white patrol car negotiating the turn onto Maplewood Drive. The vehicle did not simply proceed down the street, it prowled. It decelerated to a crawl as it approached his property. The officers within visually scrutinized the house. Curtis's instincts, sharpened by years of clandestine operations and street-level interventions, were immediately aroused. He did not move. He did not retreat into the residence. He simply straightened his posture, resting his hands casually on the railing, and observed as the patrol car executed a sudden, jarring halt directly before his driveway, the front tires abruptly impacting the immaculate curb. The scene was set. The sanctuary had been violated, and the confrontation about to unfold would reverberate throughout the entire local constabulary. The doors of the police cruiser sprang open almost simultaneously. From the passenger side emerged Officer Bryce Langford, a fresh-faced recruit fresh from the academy. He appeared apprehensive, his hands instinctively adjusting his duty belt as if seeking solace in the weight of his accoutrements. However, Curtis's attention was wholly directed towards the driver, Officer Trent Harlan. Harlan exited the cruiser himself and slammed the door with unwarranted force. Harlan was a veteran of the local force, a man whose career had stagnated due to a documented history of citizen complaints and a profound deficiency in interpersonal acumen. He was stocky, his uniform stretched taut over a burgeoning midsection, with a flushed complexion and a rigidly cropped hairstyle. Harlan advanced with a deliberate, heavy gait, the stride of a man desperately endeavoring to project an authority he had not genuinely acquired. He possessed a reputation within the precinct, one that Curtis was indeed familiar with from perusing local liaison reports. Harlan was a bully cloaked in a badge, an individual who utilized his uniform to intimidate those he deemed inferior. Harlan did not approach the domicile with the circumspect, courteous demeanor of an officer conducting a routine welfare check. He marched up the paved walkway, bypassing the driveway entirely, and halted at the base of the veranda steps. He rested his right hand. It was a classic tactic of intimidation designed to immediately establish dominance. Curtis recognized the posturing instantly. He had instructed cadets on methods to de-escalate situations, and Harlan was pursuing the diametrically opposed course of action. He was entering aggressively. "Good morning," Curtis stated, his voice calm, deep, and resonant. He did not remove his hands from the railing. He did not offer a submissive smile. He simply acknowledged their presence. "Step down from the veranda," Harlan commanded, dispensing with any form of greeting. His tone was sharp, aggressive, and utterly devoid of professional civility. Curtis raised a single eyebrow. The sheer impertinence of the command, issued without any preamble or stated legal justification, was astonishing. "Pardon me?" "You heard my directive," Harlan barked, taking a step onto the first wooden stair. Officer Langford hovered a few paces behind him, appearing increasingly discomfited by his partner's aggressive initial maneuver. "Descend here forthwith." "I believe I am quite comfortable precisely where I stand, officer," Curtis responded smoothly, his voice never deviating more than a fraction of a decibel. "Is there anything I can assist you with?" Harlan's countenance darkened. a dull crimson blush ascending his thick neck. He was unaccustomed to being refused, particularly not in this neighborhood, and certainly not by an individual who resembled Curtis. We received a report concerning a suspicious individual loitering on this property. Now I shall not repeat myself. Descend from the veranda and furnish some identification. Curtis perceived a cold, hard knot of indignation form within his chest, yet his exterior remained entirely inscrutable. He possessed an intimate knowledge of the law. He was familiar with Terry versus Ohio. He understood the parameters of a lawful detainment and the definition of reasonable articulable suspicion. Standing on a porch while consuming coffee did not meet that threshold. Suspicious individual, Curtis echoed, allowing a faint, dry chuckle to escape his lips. I am enjoying coffee on a Saturday morning. You do not reside here, Harlan declared, phrasing it as an incontrovertible fact rather than an inquiry. This property has just been sold. The proprietors are not presently present. Is that the information you received from dispatch? Curtis inquired, his gaze locking onto Harlan's. The intensity within Curtis's stare was piercing, the sort of look that had induced cartel enforcers to break into a cold sweat in interrogation chambers. Do not become insolent with me, my good man, Harlan snapped, advancing another step. He was now merely a few feet from Curtis. I require your identification and your explanation of precisely what you are doing on this property before I apprehend you for trespassing. Officer, Curtis stated, leaning forward slightly, his voice descending into a register that commanded absolute attentiveness. I am under no legal obligation to provide you with identification. You lack any reasonable suspicion that I've committed, am committing, or am about to commit a criminal offense. Furthermore, you are presently trespassing on private property without a warrant or probable cause. Harlan blinked, visibly taken aback by the precise legal terminology emanating effortlessly from Curtis's tongue. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in the veteran constable's eyes, but his ego, immense and fragile, quickly superseded his common sense. He could not concede now. Not in front of his rookie partner, and not in front of this man who was defying him. Oh, we have a roadside legal expert here, Harlan sneered, his hand moving to unclip the retention strap on his holster. The sharp click resonated on the quiet suburban street. It was an explicit physical threat. Final warning. Identification now, or you will be face down on this timber. Behind Harlan, Officer Langford finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly. Hey, man. Just give him your ID. It will make this simpler. Curtis observed the young rookie, perceiving the apprehension and the unthinking obedience to a toxic superior. Then he looked back at Harlan. The unclipped holster signified a substantial escalation. Harlan had exceeded all boundaries, operating entirely on bruised pride and deeply ingrained prejudice. Curtis possessed his wallet in his rear pocket. Within that wallet resided a gold shield that commanded the respect of every law enforcement agency in the nation. He could produce it, display his credentials, and terminate this exchange in mere seconds. Harlan would turn ashen, stammer an apology, and retreat sheepishly to his patrol car. However, Curtis did not reach for his wallet. If he displayed his badge now, Harlan would learn nothing. Harlan would merely assume he had erred in confronting a VIP. He would fail to grasp the inherent flaw in his aggressive, unconstitutional policing. He would venture out tomorrow and perpetrate the exact same action against an innocent teenager or a father returning from a night shift. Someone who lacked a gold shield to offer them protection. No. Curtis determined that Harlan needed to self-destruct. He needed to fully commit to his actions on record so that the repercussions would be unavoidable. I am not providing you with my identification, Curtis stated, his voice resonating with absolute, unwavering authority. And if you intend to apprehend me, you had best be entirely certain you comprehend the statutes you are about to transgress. Harlan's eyes narrowed into slits of unadulterated fury. Hands behind your back, he growled, lunging forward, reaching aggressively for Curtis's wrist. The snare had been sprung, the dominoes had commenced their descent, and Officer Trent Harlan was completely oblivious to the calamitous career demolition he was currently orchestrating. Officer Trent Harlan moved with the ponderous, uncoordinated ferocity of a man propelled entirely by adrenaline and wounded pride. As his thick hand shot out to grasp Curtis's wrist, the air on the porch seemed to freeze. Curtis Vaughn was a man who had survived armed confrontations in clandestine drug dens and close-quarters combat with desperate fugitives. He could have incapacitated Harlan in mere seconds. He knew 5 distinct methods to break the officer's hold, subdue him onto the mahogany deck, and render him unconscious before the rookie Langford could even draw his sidearm from its holster. Yet Curtis did nothing of the sort. Decades of federal law enforcement training, coupled with a profound, sobering comprehension of how these situations historically escalated for black men in America, superseded his innate fight-or-flight response. He became entirely pliant, offering no physical resistance whatsoever, denying Harlan the singular outcome he desperately desired, a justification for escalating to violence. "I am not resisting," Curtis declared clearly, his voice carrying across the meticulously landscaped lawn, ensuring that the apprehensive rookie and any observing neighbors could hear it. "I am complying under coercion. This constitutes an unlawful apprehension." "Silence your discourse," Harlan spat, violently wrenching Curtis's right arm behind his back. The sheer force of the movement tweaked Curtis's shoulder joint, a sharp pang of discomfort shooting down his bicep. Harlan kicked Curtis's feet apart with the heavy toe of his boot, exerting his full body weight against Curtis's back, pinning him awkwardly against the veranda railing. Click, clack, ratchet. The cold steel of the Smith & Wesson handcuffs bit aggressively into Curtis's wrists. Harlan deliberately tightened the restraints an extra notch, a petty, vindictive maneuver known among corrupt officers as inflicting the bracelets. The metal immediately began to impede the circulation to Curtis's hands. "Search his person, Langford," Harlan barked, breathing heavily, perspiration beading on his forehead despite the crisp autumn morning. Officer Langford stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he patted down Curtis's athletic trousers. He located the rectangular protrusion in Curtis's rear right pocket. Langford extracted the worn, dark brown leather wallet. "Got his wallet, Trent?" Langford stated, holding it out. "Deposit it in the cruiser," Harlan commanded, not even glancing at it. His focus was entirely on physically dominating the man who had dared to address him with authority. "We shall ascertain the identity of this John Doe once we convey him to processing. Let us proceed." Harlan seized Curtis by the central chain of the handcuffs, yanking upward, another agonizing compliance hold designed to force a detainee onto their toes. Curtis gritted his teeth, enduring the pain, his countenance a mask of absolute, terrifying composure. He permitted Harlan to escort him down his own front steps, along the paved walkway he had financed, and toward the idling police cruiser. Across the street behind the Venetian blinds of 442 Maplewood Drive, Vivian Hargrove observed the unfolding scene with a blend of vindication and sudden, creeping disquietude. She had desired the removal of the suspicious individual, certainly, but witnessing the sheer aggression of the apprehension, the manner in which the officer yanked the man, the way the man remained so eerily calm and unruffled, caused a cold knot to form in her stomach. The man did not resemble a apprehended burglar. He resembled a monarch momentarily inconvenienced by commoners. Vivian let the blind snap shut, abruptly wishing she had not initiated the call. Harlan shoved Curtis forcefully into the rear of the cruiser, forcefully guiding his head down to clear the doorframe. The molded plastic seat of the patrol car was hard and carried a faint aroma of industrial disinfectant and aged perspiration. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing Curtis within the claustrophobic reinforced enclosure. Through the plexiglass divider, Curtis observed Harlan and Langford ascend into the front seats. "Energized this morning, aren't we?" Harlan chuckled to his partner, a sickening sound of self-satisfaction. He slapped the steering wheel. "Thought he was a tough guy. Thought he understood the law. Let's see how much he relishes the holding cell." Langford did not laugh. He appeared pale, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, making brief, uncomfortable contact with Curtis's unwavering gaze. "Hey, Trent," he said. "He claimed he owned the premises. What if he actually purchased it?" "Give me a respite, Bryce," Harlan scoffed, engaging the cruiser in drive and pulling away from the curb with a screech of tires. "Observe him. Note his attire. He does not reside in Oak Ridge Estates, likely casing the establishment, anticipating the departure of the moving vans so he could strip the copper wiring. I have witnessed this scenario 100 times." Curtis sat in the rear, silent and stoic. He did not argue. He did not hurl epithets. He was engaged in diligent work. Within his thoughts, he was meticulously documenting every detail. Officer Trent Harlan, badge designation 4482. Officer Bryce Langford, badge designation 519. Cruiser identification Adam 12. He felt the constricting pinch of the restraint severing his circulation, a tangible reminder of the egregious violation of his civil liberties. Harlan believed he had prevailed. Harlan believed he was transporting an insignificant individual to the local detention facility to impart a lesson on respecting authority. Curtis leaned his head back against the rigid plastic partition and closed his eyes. A grim, mirthless smile played at the corners of his mouth. The journey to the precinct was brief, but the ramifications of this apprehension would endure Trent Harlan for the entirety of his existence. The Oak Ridge Township Police Department was housed within a squat, utilitarian brick edifice that had seen more prosperous times. Within, the atmosphere was dense with the odor of stale brewed coffee, inexpensive floor polish, and the low, persistent hum of fluorescent illumination. It was a quiet Saturday morning shift. The nocturnal inebriates had already been processed, and the daytime officers were largely engaged in patrol. Harlan hauled Curtis from the cruiser by the handcuff chain, dragging him through the heavy metal rear portals and into the booking area. The precinct was a familiar milieu to Curtis, though typically he was the one entering through the front doors in a tailored suit, displaying a gold badge to assume responsibility for a federal case. Being marched in through the suspect entrance in athletic trousers and handcuffs was a novel, albeit infuriating, experience. Behind the elevated booking desk sat Sergeant Harlan Brooks. Brooks was a veteran, a man with a graying mustache and weary eyes who dedicated his days to navigating a morass of administrative documentation. He glanced up from a pile of arrest reports as Harlan shoved Curtis toward the metal bench affixed to the floor. "Sit," Harlan commanded, forcing Curtis down onto the bench. Curtis sat, his posture perfectly erect, his countenance an unreadable stone. "Good morning, Smitty," Harlan called out, utilizing Brooks's precinct moniker. He sauntered up to the booking desk, leaning against the high counter with an air of casual arrogance. "I have an interesting individual for you. Trespassing, failure to identify, resisting apprehension, the entire spectrum." Sergeant Brooks sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He retrieved a blank booking form and clicked his pen. "Resisting? Really, Trent?" "He does not appear to have offered much resistance." "He was being insolent," Harlan defended, his tone instantly defensive. "Disobeyed lawful directives, was prowling around that new property over on Maplewood. I had to take him down to get the restraints on." From the bench, Curtis spoke. His voice was tranquil, conversational, and entirely devoid of the alarm or fury typically heard in the booking area. "For the record, Sergeant, none of that is factual. There's dashcam and bodycam footage that will confirm I was enjoying coffee on my own patio." Harlan spun around, thrusting a thick, accusatory digit at him. "Hey, you speak when addressed. Do you comprehend me?" Brooks's brow furrowed, his gaze drifting past Harlan to intently examine the man on the bench. Something felt amiss. The detainee wasn't behaving like a minor offender, and he certainly wasn't acting like someone who had just been forcibly apprehended. His vocabulary was precise. His composure was unnervingly calm. "Identity?" Brooks inquired, looking directly at Curtis. "He refused to provide it," Harlan interjected, reaching into his cargo pocket. He withdrew Curtis's dark leather wallet and flung it onto the booking counter. "Here, search his belongings. Let's ascertain this fellow's true identity." The wallet landed with a solid, muffled thud on the scuffed wooden counter. "Book him, Smitty," Harlan commanded, turning his back to the desk to refill his own cup of the stale precinct brew from the nearby station. "I'm going to draft the arrest report. Ensure you get his fingerprints. I need to ascertain if he has any outstanding warrants." Sergeant Brooks retrieved the wallet. It felt weightier than a standard billfold. He opened it expecting to find a driver's license, but it revealed a custom-cut leather interior instead. On the lower section was a solid gold badge, intricately detailed, crowned with a striking eagle. Encircling the central emblem were substantial, unmistakable blue enamel letters, Federal Bureau of Investigation. On the upper section of the fold was a laminated high-security identification card. It featured a stern photograph of the man currently manacled to the bench. Adjacent to the photo, printed in bold, irrefutable lettering, it read, "Curtis Vaughn, Special Agent in Charge, Violent Crimes Task Force Division 4. The air in Sergeant Brooks's lungs evacuated. All color instantly leached from his face, rendering him akin to a man who had just received a terminal medical diagnosis. His hand commenced to tremble so violently that the substantial leather wallet clattered against the wooden counter. He fixated on the gold emblem. Then, slowly, with evident difficulty, he raised his eyes to regard the black man seated in faded sweatpants on his booking bench. Curtis met Brooks's aghast stare. Curtis offered no smile. He simply gave a single, deliberate nod. Trent," Brooks stammered. His voice was barely audible, choked with sudden, overwhelming dread. Harlan, completely unaware, was stirring powdered creamer into his coffee. "Yes. What is his name? Does John Doe have a criminal record?" "Trent," Brooks reiterated, his voice cracking. He swallowed with effort, feeling physically unwell. "Return here immediately." The sheer alarm in the sergeant's voice finally compelled Harlan to turn. He frowned, setting his coffee cup down. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a specter." Harlan returned to the desk. Brooks remained silent. He slowly rotated the wallet and slid it across the counter so it faced Harlan. Harlan peered down. Time seemed to fracture and decelerate to an absolute standstill. Harlan's eyes traced the gold metal. He read the inscription, "Federal Bureau of Investigation." His mind, sluggish and clouded by presumption, required a full moment to process the visual data. He examined the photographic identification. He read the title, "Special Agent in Charge." When the reality of the circumstances finally pierced Harlan's consciousness, the physical reaction was catastrophic. His knees literally buckled, dropping him an inch before he steadied himself against the counter. A cold perspiration erupted across his forehead instantaneously. The arrogant flush on his cheeks vanished, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray hue. He had just aggressively assaulted, unlawfully detained, and essentially abducted a high-ranking federal agent on his own property. Oh my goodness," Harlan whispered, the words escaping his lips involuntarily. He retreated from the counter as if the wallet were a live ordnance about to detonate. His eyes, wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, flickered towards Officer Langford, who had just entered the booking area carrying Curtis's coffee mug from the porch, and stopped abruptly. He observed Brooks's pallid complexion, his suboptimal state, then Harlan's quivering hands. "What? What is it?" No one responded. The silence in the booking room was deafening, punctuated only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the ragged, panicked exhalations of Officer Trent Harlan. From the bench, the metallic clinking of the handcuff chain sliced through the tension. Curtis Vaughn shifted his weight, his bearing commanding, despite the restraints. "Sergeant Brooks," Curtis stated, his voice resonating like a judge's decree in the hushed chamber. Brooks snapped to attention, his posture rigid. "Yes, sir. Yes, Agent Vaughn," Curtis instructed, his tone icy and utterly unyielding. "You will approach this desk and remove these restraints. Officer Harlan is not to come within 10 feet of me. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Brooks nearly tripped over his own chair as he scrambled around the counter, a set of handcuff keys already clutched in his trembling hand. "Immediately, sir." The power dynamic in the room had not merely shifted, it had violently inverted. The local police station no longer belonged to Trent Harlan. It belonged to Special Agent Curtis Vaughn, and the consequence had only just commenced. The metallic click of the handcuff key turning in the lock was the most pronounced sound in the Oak Ridge Township Police Precinct. Sergeant Harlan Brooks's hand shook so severely that it required 3 agonizing attempts to seat the diminutive key into the mechanism. When the heavy steel finally sprang open, Special Agent Vaughn did not rub his wrists. He did not flinch, even though deep, angry, red welts had already formed into bruised grooves on his skin. He simply rose from the metal bench. The physical transformation was immediate. In his faded gray sweatpants and plain white t-shirt, Curtis suddenly seemed to occupy the entire space. The quiet, compliant man on the porch had vanished. In his place stood a furious, highly trained federal commander who had just had his constitutional rights violently violated. "My wallet, Sergeant," Curtis stated, extending his left hand. Brooks practically lunged across the desk to return it, his eyes fixed firmly on the linoleum floor. "Yes, sir. Agent Vaughn, I apologize, sir." Curtis snapped the wallet shut and slipped it into his pocket. He redirected his attention to Officer Trent Harlan. Harlan remained pressed against the far wall of the booking area, appearing as though all the air had been siphoned from his lungs. His flushed, arrogant complexion had entirely dissipated, replaced by a sickly, translucent pallor. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping wheeze emerged. Beside him, the rookie Bryce Langford stood frozen, the half-empty coffee mug he had brought from Curtis's porch trembling in his grasp. "Officer Harlan," Curtis stated, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying stillness of an approaching tempest. "Under Title 18, United States Code, Section 24, it is a federal offense for any individual acting under the guise of law to willfully deprive any person of a right or privilege protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. Do you comprehend the penalty for unlawful detention under color of law?" Harlan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. "Agent Vaughn, please listen. This was a misunderstanding. The call came in. The dispatcher said—" "Do not insult my intelligence," Curtis commanded, the sudden volume cutting through the air like a lash. Harlan flinched visibly. "I did not resist. I informed you that you lacked reasonable articulable suspicion. I informed you that you were on private property. You proceeded to trespass, commit aggravated battery, and unlawfully detain me because your fragile ego could not countenance a black man in an affluent neighborhood denying you." "What in blazes is all this commotion about?" a gruff voice demanded. The heavy wooden door leading to the administrative offices swung open, and Captain Warren Fletcher strode into the booking area. Fletcher was a stern, no-nonsense commander with years on the force, a man fiercely protective of his department's reputation. He took one look at the scene. Sergeant Brooks looking terrified, Harlan pressed against the wall, looking violently ill, and a man in sweatpants standing in the center of the room, radiating pure authority. "Smitty," Fletcher barked at Brooks. "Who is this individual, and why is he not in a holding cell?" "Captain," Brooks squeaked, his voice failing him. He pointed a trembling finger at Curtis. That is Special Agent in Charge Curtis Vaughn, FBI Violent Crimes Task Force." Captain Fletcher stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from Brooks to Curtis, then to the angry red handcuff mark still conspicuously visible on Curtis's wrists, and finally landed on Harlan. Fletcher did not require the complete narrative to grasp that his department was teetering on the precipice of a monumental legal and public relations crisis. "Agent Vaughn," Fletcher stated, his tone instantly transitioning from authoritative to exceedingly cautious. "Captain Warren Fletcher, I presume there has been a colossal breach of protocol here." "That is the understatement of the decade, Captain," Curtis replied, turning to face the commanding officer. "Your officer here circumvented a lawful Terry stop, disregarded my invocation of my rights, physically assaulted me on my own front porch, and illegally transported me to this facility. He accomplished this without a scintilla of probable cause, predicated entirely on a fabricated telephone call and his own blatant racial prejudice." "He was loitering," Harlan blurted out. a desperate, pathetic attempt to salvage his imploding career. "Captain, the residence was vacant. I had a duty to investigate." "Cease your prattle, Harlan," Fletcher roared, his face assuming a dangerous shade of purple. He turned back to Curtis. "Agent Vaughn, I will address this internally. I assure you he will face severe disciplinary action." "No, Captain. You will not address this internally," Curtis corrected him, his tone permitting absolutely no leeway for negotiation. "This is no longer a local administrative matter. This constitutes a federal civil rights violation. I require the body camera footage from both of these officers to be secured immediately. I demand the dashcam footage from cruiser Adam 12 be downloaded, and I want the unedited audio of the dispatch call from my neighbor." Fletcher hesitated for a fraction of a second. The impulse to shield his own clashed with the chilling reality of defying a federal task force commander. "Agent Vaughn," Fletcher began, "I understand your indignation, but perhaps we could step into my office. Captain Fletcher, if you do not secure that evidence forthwith, my subsequent communication will be with the United States Attorney's Office to procure a federal warrant for this entire precinct," Curtis declared, extracting a sleek, encrypted government smartphone from his pocket. "Are we poised for a jurisdictional conflict this morning, or will you apprehend your errant officer?" The precinct fell into deathly silence. Fletcher glanced at Harlan, observing the perspiration streaming down the veteran officer's face, seeing the guilt profoundly etched across his posture. The captain recognized a lost cause when he encountered one. "Sergeant Brooks," Fletcher commanded, his voice laden with resignation. "Secure the body cameras from Harlan and Langford. Archive the files in the digital evidence vault. Deliver the encryption key directly to me." "Yes, Captain." Brooks practically bolted to comply. Fletcher turned his furious gaze upon Harlan. "Trent, relinquish your badge and your service weapon at once." "Cap, please," Harlan pleaded, tears of sheer panic finally welling in his eyes. He had a mortgage. He had a pension at stake. He had spent years intimidating others, and in mere minutes it was all being incinerated. "Do not do this. I have dedicated years to this service, and you have just squandered every single one of them. Weapon and badge now, or I will have you forcibly dispossessed of them," Fletcher snarled. With quivering hands, Officer Trent Harlan unclipped his duty belt. The heavy thud of the loaded holster striking the booking desk sounded like a death knell. He slowly unpinned the silver shield from his chest and placed it beside the firearm. "You are suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a comprehensive federal investigation," Fletcher stated, disgust evident. He gestured towards the very holding cell Harlan had intended to confine Curtis within. "Enter the cell, Trent." Harlan looked up, aghast. "What? Cap, you cannot place me in there. Not within my own precinct." "You are presently a suspect in a felony civil rights investigation," Curtis interjected, his voice devoid of any compassion. "Enter the cell." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Trent Harlan slowly walked towards the steel bars. The heavy door clanged shut behind him with a resonant, inescapable finality. Within moments, the quiet, mundane atmosphere of the Oak Ridge Township Police Precinct was utterly shattered. 3 dark, unmarked SUVs with heavily tinted windows tore into the precinct's parking lot, effectively corralling the local cruisers. 5 federal agents clad in tactical khakis and dark windbreakers bearing the bold yellow FBI insignia across their backs strode through the front doors. They did not pause at the front desk. They bypassed the security gate and marched directly into the booking area, their presence seemingly vacuuming whatever remaining oxygen lingered in the room. Leading the contingent was Supervisory Special Agent Michael Briggs, Curtis's second-in-command. Briggs was a compact powerhouse of a man, built like a linebacker, with a perpetually unimpressed countenance. When he observed Curtis standing near the desk, rubbing the faint red lines on his wrists, Briggs's eyes darkened with a lethal, protective fury. "Boss," Briggs stated, his voice a low rumble. He looked past Curtis to where Captain Fletcher stood, looking exceedingly uncomfortable, and then to the holding cell where Trent Harlan sat with his head buried in his hands. "Tell me we are shutting this establishment down." "Not the entire facility, Mike," Curtis stated calmly. "Merely securing the scene. I require you to assume full custody of the digital evidence, body cameras, dash cams, and the dispatch logs from this morning." "Done," Briggs affirmed, gesturing to two agents who immediately flanked Sergeant Brooks at the computer terminal. "What about the officers involved?" "Officer Harlan is in the cell. The rookie Langford is in the break room compiling a statement," Curtis explained. He turned back to Captain Fletcher, who was observing the federal takeover of his station with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Captain, your rookie has a decision to make today. He can document precisely what transpired, or he can attempt to shield his training officer and face a federal conspiracy charge. I advise you to go and counsel him to report the truth. I will ensure his recollection remains perfectly lucid." "Agent Vaughn," Fletcher stated tightly, turning on his heel to head for the break room. "One more thing, Captain," Curtis called out, halting Fletcher in his tracks. Curtis walked over to the booking desk, leaning against it casually. This presented a stark contrast to the way he had been forcefully shoved beneath the bench moments prior. "We have addressed the officers who violated my rights. Now, I wish to address the civilian who instigated this entire cascade of events by weaponizing your dispatch center." Fletcher sighed, rubbing his temples. "The 911 caller," Curtis stated, having already mentally logged the address from the dispatch audio Brooks had just played for him. 442 Maplewood Drive. She explicitly informed your dispatcher that she believed I was a criminal casing a residence despite observing moving trucks unloading my belongings for days. She fabricated a threat to prompt an armed police response against a black man in her neighborhood. "Swatting?" Agent Briggs muttered from the computer terminal, his tone laced with disdain. "Precisely," Curtis nodded. "Filing a false police report and misusing the 911 emergency system are misdemeanors in this state, are they not?" "They are," Fletcher admitted, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "But typically in these neighborhood disputes, we simply issue a warning." "Captain Fletcher," Curtis interrupted, his voice returning to that icy, unyielding register. "If a teenager called in a fake bomb threat to a high school, you would not issue a warning. You would apprehend them for the chaos and danger they instigated. Vivian Hargrove artificially manufactured a high-risk police encounter that resulted in a federal agent being assaulted and unlawfully detained. She created a scenario where I or your officers could have been fatalities." Curtis stepped closer to the captain. "I demand a cruiser be dispatched to 442 Maplewood Drive. I require her to be cited on the record for misuse of the emergency system. If she offers any resistance, I require her to be taken into custody." The era of individuals utilizing the police department as their personal weaponized concierge service to enforce their racial prejudices concludes today. Captain Fletcher gazed into Curtis's eyes and perceived absolutely no hint of a bluff. The FBI was not going to overlook this transgression. If the local police did not handle it, the federal government would likely devise a means to make it considerably more arduous for the township. "Smitty," Fletcher called out to the desk sergeant. "Radio Unit 7, dispatch them to 442 Maplewood. Instruct them to issue a criminal citation for filing a false report to one Vivian Hargrove. If she presents them with any objection, instruct them to place her in handcuffs and bring her down here." Back in the pristine, tranquil confines of Oak Ridge Estates, Vivian Hargrove was presently repotting a fern on her front windowsill. She felt a profound sense of gratification. The suspicious individual had been removed in the rear of a police vehicle. Order had been restored to her immaculate, unblemished neighborhood. She had fulfilled her civic obligation. She was so engrossed in patting down the potting soil that she failed to hear the police cruiser pull up until the heavy car door slammed shut. Vivian looked up, a bright, welcoming smile spreading across her face. She wiped her hands on her floral apron and hurried to the front door, eager to express her gratitude to the officers for their prompt and decisive actions. She pulled the door open just as two uniformed officers, distinct from those who had arrived earlier, stepped onto her porch. "Good morning, officers," Vivian chimed, beaming at them. I am so pleased you have returned. I assume you dealt with that dreadful man across the street. I simply could not fathom he was audacious enough to stand right there on the porch." The elder of the two officers, a seasoned patrolman named Jenkins, did not reciprocate her smile. He regarded her with a blend of exhaustion and profound irritation. He held a thick yellow citation pad in his left hand. "Ma'am, are you Vivian Hargrove?" Officer Jenkins inquired formally. "Yes, of course," Vivian replied, her smile faltering slightly at his stern tone. "Is there an issue? Did he have accomplices?" "Ma'am, the individual you contacted the police about is the legal proprietor of the property at 440, Jenkins stated flatly. "He is also a special agent in charge of investigations." Vivian's mouth dropped open. The color rapidly drained from her face, rendering her as pale as the expensive lilies in her garden. "I beg your pardon." "What? That cannot be correct. He was wearing sweatpants. He appeared to be a ruffian. He was consuming coffee on his own property." "Mrs. Hargrove," the second officer chimed in, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Because of your telephone call," Jenkins continued, stepping closer and unclicking his pen, "our officers engaged in an unlawful apprehension of a federal agent. You conjured a non-existent peril, a significant drain on our resources, and profoundly perilous. I fabricated nothing." Vivian shrieked, sheer terror gripping her as the officer began scribbling on his notepad. "I observed an individual exhibiting suspicious behavior. It is my prerogative to contact law enforcement." "It is your right to report a transgression, madam," Jenkins clarified. "It is unlawful to exploit the 911 system to harass a neighbor simply because their appearance displeases you. I am issuing you a formal citation for the misuse of the emergency dispatch service." He tore the yellow carbon copy from the pad and extended it toward her. Vivian regarded the document as if it were laced with venom. "A criminal citation? You are issuing me a ticket? Do you comprehend the duration of my residency in this district?" "I'm acquainted with the mayor." Jenkins' demeanor grew stern. He gestured toward the handcuffs clipped to his belt. "You may endorse the citation and present yourself in court next month to settle the penalty, or you may decline to sign, in which case I will place you under immediate arrest and transport you to the detention center. Considering the current atmosphere at the station, I strongly advise you to affix your signature to the document." Vivian glanced at the officer's hand, hovering near his restraints. She surveyed the opposite side of the street, noting the vacant porch where the man had been standing. The gravity of her actions, the sheer, overwhelming scope of her misjudgment finally descended upon her. With hands that trembled and were dusted with soil, she accepted the pen and inscribed her name, thereby cementing her public mortification. Her haven was irrevocably lost. She would henceforth be recognized as the woman who summoned the authorities on a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent. The mechanisms of federal justice operate with deliberate slowness, yet once they fix upon a target, they engage with absolute, unyielding precision. The occurrence at 440 Maplewood Drive did not simply dissolve into the bureaucratic void of internal investigations. It became a pivotal case for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Months following that brisk autumn morning, the interior of the United States District Court was oppressively silent. Trent Harlan, entirely divested of the uniform he had wielded as a weapon for over a decade, occupied the defense table. He was attired in a poorly fitting gray suit, his posture slumped, his countenance visibly aged by the incessant pressure of the federal indictment. He bore no resemblance to the arrogant, flushed officer who had aggressively approached Curtis Vaughn's driveway. He appeared defeated. The federal prosecutor had systematically dismantled Harlan's defense. The body camera footage captured by Officer Langford, which Captain Fletcher had prudently preserved and submitted to the FBI, was damning. It depicted Curtis's complete compliance, his composed assertion of his rights, and Harlan's immediate aggressive escalation. It documented the unclipped holster, the forceful restraint against the railing, and the maliciously tightened handcuffs. Confronted by an overwhelming volume of incontrovertible evidence and the complete withdrawal of support from the police union, which rapidly disassociated itself from the disastrous public relations calamity, Harlan had no alternative but to accept a plea agreement. Judge Arthur Pendleton, a no-nonsense federal magistrate with absolutely no tolerance for law enforcement malfeasance, fixed his gaze upon Harlan from the bench. "Mr. Harlan," Judge Pendleton's voice reverberated through the mahogany-paneled courtroom, "law enforcement personnel are entrusted with an immense degree of authority. You perverted that authority. You permitted your deeply ingrained prejudices to supersede your training, the law, and fundamental human kindness. You physically assaulted and abducted an individual on his own property solely because he did not conform to your narrow, prejudiced perception of what a homeowner in that neighborhood ought to resemble. The fact that your victim happened to be a highly decorated federal agent proved to be your undoing. However, it raises the disturbing inquiry. How many times have you subjected private citizens to this treatment who lack the means to defend themselves?" Harlan kept his eyes fixed on the defense table, his hands quivering. "For the federal charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 42 months in a federal penitentiary," Judge Pendleton declared, his gavel striking with a decisive crack. "Upon your release, you will be subject to 3 years of supervised probation. You are permanently prohibited from holding any position in law enforcement, security, or public office. You will forfeit your municipal pension in its entirety." Harlan emitted a choked, despairing sob. The inevitable consequences had fully materialized. He was destined for federal prison. His financial prospects were utterly annihilated, and his wife, unable to endure the public shame and the cessation of their primary income, had initiated divorce proceedings months earlier. The residence he had dedicated his life to paying off was already entering foreclosure. He had forfeited everything, all for mere minutes of unbridled ego. Officer Bryce Langford fared better, though his career bore permanent scars. He had provided complete testimony against Harlan, offering a thorough and truthful account of his training officer's confrontational conduct. He retained his badge, but he was demoted to probationary status, reassigned to a different precinct, and mandated to undergo extensive de-escalation and bias training. Every officer in the department suddenly understood precisely where the boundary lay, but the ramifications extended far beyond the police force. Back in Oak Ridge Estates, Vivian Hargrove's meticulously constructed existence had imploded with spectacular rapidity. The criminal citation for the misuse of the 911 system was merely the commencement. The narrative of her calling the police on a black FBI agent moving into the neighborhood leaked to the local press. The headline, "Local Woman Swats, New Neighbor, Arrests FBI Commander," became a viral phenomenon. Vivian's phone ceased to ring. The acquaintances who previously joined her for afternoon tea now veered across the street when they observed her walking her dog. The Homeowners Association, desperate to cleanse their esteemed community's reputation of racial prejudice, convened an emergency session. Vivian was unanimously removed from her board position. When she attempted to attend the neighborhood block party in the spring, she was politely but firmly requested to depart. Incapable of enduring the frigid ostracization and the pervasive, suffocating humiliation, Vivian quietly listed 442 Maplewood Drive for sale. She packed her belongings in the dead of night, relocating to a smaller, more affordable town where her name was unknown, forever haunted by the colossal, life-altering error she had committed while observing through her Venetian blinds. As for Special Agent Curtis Vaughn, his life settled into the tranquil cadence he had originally sought. It was a warm Saturday morning in late spring. The mahogany porch of 440 Maplewood Drive gleamed, having received the fresh coat of sealant Curtis had promised. The moving boxes had long since vanished, replaced by comfortable wicker furniture and vibrant hanging ferns. Curtis emerged from the front door clad in comfortable athletic shorts and a plain t-shirt. He carried 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He handed one to his daughter, Riley, who was home for the summer and seated on the porch swing, engrossed in a textbook. "Thanks, Dad," Riley smiled, accepting the mug. She surveyed the tranquil, manicured street. "It is so peaceful out here. You really picked a great spot." "It has its moments," Curtis replied, a knowing, quiet smile touching the corners of his lips. He leaned against the wooden railing, taking a slow sip of his coffee. The morning air was perfect. As he stood there, a local Oak Ridge Township police cruiser slowly rounded the corner and proceeded down Maplewood Drive. It was not surveilling. It was merely conducting a routine neighborhood patrol. As the cruiser passed Curtis's residence, the officer in the driver's seat, a young, sharp-looking patrolman, caught Curtis's eye. The officer did not stop. He did not demand identification. He simply raised a hand, offering a crisp, respectful gesture of acknowledgement. Curtis nodded back, his posture relaxed, his eyes reflecting the profound, hard-won serenity of a man who had stood his ground. He turned back to his daughter, the morning sun warming the porch, knowing that his sanctuary was finally, unconditionally, his own. This narrative serves as a stark, dramatic examination of the devastating repercussions of unbridled prejudice and the abuse of authority. Although presented through the unexpected turn of events wherein the victim is revealed to be an unassailable federal agent, it underscores the harsh realities many encounter daily when confronted by institutional bias and aggressive policing. Officer Holland's ultimate downfall and Vivian Hargrove's social exile exemplify the inescapable retribution that follows when the misuse of power is finally brought into the light of accountability. It serves as a reminder that true authority is founded upon respect for the law and the Constitution, not on a badge or a particular postal code. In this story, a man stands on his own porch with a cup of coffee, at peace, harmless, finally breathing after years of diligent effort. However, a single phone call transforms that peace into a perceived threat. A neighbor observes a black man in an affluent neighborhood and concludes he must be a danger, not a homeowner. Minutes later, officers arrive already convinced, already confrontational, already prepared to assert control. And here lies the life lesson that strikes with the force of a blow. When someone is determined to misunderstand you, your dignity becomes your shield and your preparedness becomes your salvation. Curtis Vaughn could have instantly diffused the confrontation by presenting his FBI credentials. He chose a more courageous path. He maintained his composure and allowed the aggressor to expose himself on record. Because the truth is, most individuals do not possess a badge of honor to protect them. Most people possess only their voice, their composure, and whatever evidence can withstand falsehoods. That is why this story holds significance. It is not merely about retribution. It is about how unchecked ego transforms authority into violence, and why the smallest actions, recording, documenting, remaining calm, knowing your rights, can be the difference between being crushed and being heard. And for anyone who has ever been judged based on their skin color, attire, accent, professional title, or financial standing, remember this. You do not need to diminish yourself to accommodate another's comfort. You belong where you have earned your place, and you require no permission to exist in peace. Allow others to underestimate you if they so choose. Just ensure you are living in a manner that allows truth to stand by your side when the clamor intensifies. Now, I wish to hear from you. Have you ever been subjected to unfair judgment or treated as though you did not belong? What was your course of action in that moment? Share your experience in the comments section. Your words could offer solace to someone else. And if you desire more emotionally resonant, impactful life lessons conveyed through stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you do not miss the subsequent installment.